In the middle of a desolate forest in the Rocky Mountains, a veteran and his loyal dog are tracking large prey. But suddenly, the dog stops, completely ignoring the hunt. It rushes towards a forgotten ravine and digs frantically, as if compelled by an unseen force. What it finds is not an animal, but a forgotten relic of war, hiding both a promise and a warning. They have no idea that fulfilling that promise will make them the target of those who will do anything to ensure that warning is never spoken. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence of the Colorado Rockies in late autumn was a language Jack Callahan had come to understand. It spoke in the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, the crisp snap of a twig underfoot, and the vast, empty blue of the sky. After years spent in places where silence meant danger, where it was merely the breath held before an explosion, this quiet was a balm. It was his sanctuary. His only companion in this self-imposed exile was Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose presence was as steady and comforting as the mountains themselves. Shadow's coat was a magnificent blend of slate gray and snow white, thick and plush against the encroaching cold. His eyes, the color of dark amber, held an intelligence that went beyond simple animal instinct. He was more than a dog. He was Jack's anchor, a living, breathing tether to the present when the ghosts of his past threatened to pull him under. Jack Callahan himself looked like a man carved from the very mountains he inhabited. In his late 50s, he was tall and lean, the hard muscle of his army days holding firm against the passage of time. His short brown hair was heavily salted with silver at the temples, and his face was a roadmap of a life lived hard, the lines etched around his kind eyes telling stories of both hardship and resilience. He wore his usual attire, a faded navy blue flannel shirt over a gray thermal, worn denim jeans, and a pair of sturdy work boots that had seen thousands of miles of rugged terrain. The bolt-action rifle slung over his shoulder felt like a familiar extension of his arm, a tool for sustenance, not for war. They were tracking an elk. A fresh trail had appeared after the morning's light frost, and the promise of stocking his larder for the harsh winter ahead had pulled Jack deeper into the national forest than he usually ventured. Shadow moved ahead, silent and fluid, his body low to the ground, a perfect picture of focused predatory grace. Jack followed, his senses sharp, his mind blessedly empty of everything but the hunt. This was the peace he sought, a primal clarity that left no room for the echoing shouts and rattling gunfire of distant deserts. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. The elk trail continued straight ahead, clear and inviting, but the dog froze, his head cocked, one white-tipped ear swiveling to the north. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound of confusion, not aggression. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. He scanned the dense thicket of aspens and firs, his eyes searching for any sign of a bear or mountain lion. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound other than the wind. Shadow ignored the elk trail completely. He turned 90 degrees and began to push his way through the underbrush, his whining growing more insistent. He looked back over his shoulder, his amber eyes locking with Jack's, urging him to follow. Jack sighed. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own these days. An elk was just meat, but a warning from Shadow was something to be heeded. He followed, the branches whipping at his face as he descended into a narrow, rocky ravine he had never seen before. The air grew colder in the cleft of the mountain, the sunlight struggling to pierce the canopy above. Shadow's excitement was palpable now, his tail giving a few tense wags as he began to dig frantically at the base of a rock slide, sending a shower of dirt and loose stones flying. "Easy, boy. What have you found?" Jack knelt beside him, pushing aside a larger rock. Underneath the layer of soil and fallen leaves, something glinted. It was a dull, metallic sheen, unnatural in this world of stone and wood. Curiosity overpowering his caution, Jack used his hands to clear away more of the debris. The glint became a patch of metal, then a larger sheet. It was olive drab green, covered in decades of grime, but unmistakably man-made. As he and Shadow worked together, the man pulling away rocks and the dog clearing soil with his paws, the shape began to reveal itself. It was the torn, jagged edge of an airplane wing, and on its surface, faded but still visible, was the ghost of a white star inside a blue circle. Jack's breath caught in his chest. He stood up slowly, his eyes tracing the path of wreckage that disappeared up the steep wooded slope of the ravine. Time and countless seasons of snow and rockfall had nearly swallowed it whole. He moved forward, his hunter's instincts replaced by a soldier's solemn reverence. He saw a piece of the fuselage, a bent propeller blade half buried in the earth, and then, nestled between two ancient pines that had grown up around it, the cockpit. It was crushed, the canopy long since shattered, the metal skin peeled back like a discarded can. Jack placed a hand on the cold, rusted metal. The silence here was different. It was not the peaceful silence of the mountains. It was heavy, profound, filled with the echo of a final, violent moment from a world away, a lifetime ago. He peered inside. The instruments were broken and corroded, a thick layer of pine needles and dirt covering everything. He felt a deep, resonant sorrow settle in his soul. This was not just a forgotten piece of machinery. This was a tomb, the final resting place of a pilot, a brother in arms he would never know, who had met his end alone on this cold mountainside. The wind sighed through the broken cockpit, a mournful whisper that seemed to carry the weight of 80 years. Jack Callahan, who had come to the mountains to forget the ghosts of war, had just found one waiting for him. A soldier does not leave another soldier behind. The creed was etched into Jack's soul, a law more absolute than any written statute. Though decades separated him from this fallen pilot, the kinship was immediate and undeniable. He could not leave this man nameless, a mere footnote in a forgotten crash report. He owed him a name. He owed him the dignity of being remembered. With a new sense of purpose, Jack moved carefully around the wreckage. Shadow stayed close, his usual boundless energy replaced by a quiet watchfulness, as if he understood the solemnity of the task. Jack began a more thorough search of the cockpit, his gloved fingers carefully sifting through the compacted layers of earth and rust. He found nothing but shattered dials and brittle, severed wires. It seemed the mountain had claimed everything, erasing the pilot's identity along with his life. A wave of frustration washed over him. It felt like a final injustice to have one story silenced so completely. He was about to step back when Shadow, who had been patiently observing from the edge of the fuselage, pushed past him. The dog lowered his head, his powerful nose twitching as he sniffed intently at the mangled floor beneath the pilot's seat. A low, guttural whine started deep in his chest. He pawed at the rusted metal, then looked up at Jack, his amber eyes insistent. "Nothing there, boy," Jack said softly. "I've already looked," Shadow whined again, louder this time, and pawed more forcefully at a twisted section of the floor pan. He refused to move. Jack had learned long ago that arguing with the dog's nose was a fool's errand. There was something there, something Jack's eyes could not see. Kneeling down, Jack examined the spot. The seat was bent forward at an unnatural angle, pinned by the buckled frame of the cockpit. Underneath it was a small, dark space, filled with hardened mud and debris. He found a sturdy piece of the plane's frame to use as a lever. Grunting with effort, he wedged it under the seat and pushed. Metal groaned in protest, but the seat lifted a few precious inches. And there it was. Shadow had been right. Tucked into a protected cavity was a dark, rectangular object. It was not metal, but leather. Carefully, Jack worked it free. It was a military-issue satchel, about the size of a book, its thick leather dark with age. Incredibly, it was almost perfectly preserved. Someone had taken great care to coat the seams and flaps with a heavy layer of beeswax, creating a waterproof seal against the relentless march of time. Jack carried the satchel to a flat, moss-covered rock away from the immediate wreckage. He felt a tremor in his hands as he wiped the grime from the brass buckles. They were stiff, but they opened with a satisfying click. He lifted the flap, a faint scent of old leather and paper rising to meet him. The first thing he saw was a photograph. It was a black and white studio portrait, its edges slightly yellowed. It showed a handsome young man in a pilot's uniform, his smile confident and warm. His arm was wrapped around a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and dark, wavy hair. Standing in front of them, holding her mother's hand, was a little girl of about 4 or 5, her face bright with a joyful, gap-toothed grin. A family, frozen in a moment of perfect happiness, unaware of the tragedy that lay ahead. Jack's throat tightened. The anonymous pilot suddenly had a face, a wife, a daughter. Beneath the photo was a letter, several pages of neat, cursive handwriting on thin airmail paper. It was unfinished. The salutation read, "To my dearest Eleanor." Jack knew he was intruding on a sacred, private moment, but he felt compelled to read a few lines. "The mountains here are so big, my little bird," the letter began, "but they are not as big as my love for you. I carry your picture with me on every flight, and it is your smile that guides me home." Jack folded the letter carefully. This man was not just a soldier, he was a loving father. At the very bottom of the satchel lay a thin manila folder, bound with a red ribbon. Stamped across the front in stark crimson ink were 2 words that made the hairs on Jack's arms stand up. Top secret. The air suddenly felt colder. This changed everything. This was no ordinary training flight. He untied the ribbon and opened the folder. Inside were several pages of highly detailed technical schematics. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, filled with complex wiring diagrams and equations that meant nothing to him. Tucked behind the diagrams was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same neat handwriting as the letter. But this writing was urgent, filled with a nervous energy. At the top of the page were 2 words, Project Chimera. Below them were notes, observations. Jack's eyes scanned the page, picking out phrases. System performance exceeds all expectations. Unprecedented detection range. Then another name appeared, mentioned several times with growing unease. Second Lieutenant Thorne questions my data again. He demands full access to the raw telemetry. His ambition worries me. I do not trust him. Jack stared at the words, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He was holding a dead man's secrets. He had a photograph of a family's lost happiness, a father's last words to his daughter, and a classified file that spoke of a secret project and a deep, gnawing suspicion. The pilot, Arthur Coleman, whose name was on the flight roster tucked into the folder, had been carrying more than just personal mementos. He had been carrying a burden and a fear. Jack carefully placed everything back in the waxed leather satchel. The mission he had felt upon finding the wreckage had now crystallized. It was no longer just about giving a soldier a name. It was about uncovering the truth of how he died and why a man like Second Lieutenant Marcus Thorne had made him so afraid. The weight of the satchel in his hands felt immense, the weight of a life, a secret, and a promise yet to be fulfilled. Back in the warmth of his cabin, the leather satchel sat on the rough-hewn pine table like a judgment. The soft glow of the kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the room, and in the quiet, the weight of the discovery pressed down on Jack. He had placed the photograph of the young family next to the lamp, and their smiling faces seemed to watch him, their joy a silent testament to all that had been lost. Shadow lay by the hearth, his head on his paws, but his eyes were fixed on Jack, sensing the deep disquiet that had settled in his master's heart. For 2 days, Jack wrestled with himself. A part of him, the part that had sought solitude to escape the complexities of the world, wanted to bury the satchel and forget he had ever found it. It was a secret that had slept for 80 years. Perhaps it deserved to sleep forever. But the other part of him, the soldier, knew that was impossible. He had found a fallen comrade. He held evidence stamped with the authority of his government. His duty was clear, even if his gut told him he was stepping into something far deeper and darker than a simple plane crash. On the third morning, with a resolve that felt as cold and hard as the frost on his window pane, he made his decision. He carefully separated the single handwritten page detailing Project Chimera and the suspicions about Lute Thorn. He folded it carefully and tucked it into a small, waterproof pouch with his own military discharge papers, a place he knew was safe. The rest of the items, the poignant photograph, the unfinished letter, and the technical schematics, he placed back into the satchel. He drove his old pickup truck into the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with more churches than stoplights. He stood on a windy street corner where the cell signal was strongest and dialed the public number for Peterson Air Force Base. The conversation was a sterile exercise in military bureaucracy until he mentioned the tail number he had found on a piece of the wreckage and the words, "Top secret." The change in tone on the other end of the line was immediate. The board operator was replaced by a sharp, commanding voice that identified itself only as operations. The questions were precise. Jack answered them with the economy of a man used to giving field reports. The instructions that followed were equally precise. He was to return to his property immediately. He was not to return to the crash site. He was not, under any circumstances, to speak to anyone about his discovery. Someone would be in touch. The line went dead. The wait was worse than the indecision. For 2 days, an unnerving silence descended. Every crunch of gravel on his driveway, every rustle in the trees, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He felt exposed, watched. He sat for hours by the fire, the pilot's story unfolding in his mind. He imagined Lieutenant Arthur Coleman, a good man, a father, who had stumbled upon a betrayal and had paid the ultimate price. The official story, whatever it was, had to be a lie. Late on the second day, a dark green Humvee rumbled up the long, unpaved road to his cabin, its engine a low growl that seemed to violate the sanctity of the mountain quiet. Jack stood on his porch, Shadow at his side, a low rumble in the dog's chest, mirroring the vehicle's engine. 3 men in uniform stepped out. 2 were young airmen, their faces impassive, their movements efficient. The third was a major, a man in his 40s with a ramrod-straight posture and cold, analytical eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Jack and his property in a single sweep. "Mr. Callahan?" the major asked, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. "I'm Major Evans. We spoke on the phone." Jack nodded, not offering a handshake. "You found the place all right." "Our job is to find things," Evans replied without a hint of a smile. "If you could lead us to the site." And Jack led them into the forest. He was struck by their speed and efficiency. It was not the careful, methodical work of an investigation team piecing together a historical puzzle. It was a recovery operation, a cleanup. They took measurements, snapped photos, and began cataloging the wreckage with a detached professionalism that felt more like sanitation than archaeology. Within a few hours, they had marked every piece for removal. Back at the cabin, as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, Major Evans got to the point. "We appreciate your report, Mr. Callahan. You've helped close the book on a long dormant case." "What was the cause?" Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral. "A known issue with the P-47's engine supercharger," Evans stated flatly, his eyes unwavering. It was a tragic but straightforward case of technical failure during a high-altitude training exercise. The file was misplaced during post-war administrative changes. You've helped us correct the record. It was a clean, simple story. A story that left no room for secret projects or untrustworthy superiors. It was a lie. "We will need to take all materials recovered from the site for the official report," the major continued, his gaze flicking to the leather satchel on the table. "It's all evidence now." This was the moment. Jack looked at the major, seeing not a fellow soldier but a bureaucrat, a man whose job was to maintain the official narrative, regardless of the truth. He felt a pang of guilt as he picked up the satchel. Giving away the photo and the letter felt like a betrayal of the family, but giving away the handwritten note felt like a betrayal of the pilot himself. He handed the satchel to Major Evans. "Everything I found is in there." The major took it without a word, his expression unchanged. He gave Jack a curt nod. "The United States Air Force thanks you for your service as a citizen. We'll take it from here. I trust this matter will remain confidential." It was not a request, it was an order. Jack watched as they loaded the satchel into their vehicle and drove away, leaving nothing behind but tire tracks in the dirt and a profound sense of unease. The curtain of silence had been drawn. The official story was sealed. But hidden safely in his cabin, tucked away with his own memories of service and sacrifice, was a single sheet of paper. It was a ghost's whisper, a final testament from a man who had refused to be silenced. And Jack knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not let that whisper fade away. The week that followed the military's visit was heavy with a silence that felt different from the peace Jack had sought. It was the silence of a story forcibly concluded, a truth deliberately buried. Major Evans and his team had been thorough. The crash site was now just a scar on the mountainside, stripped of its history. The official report would be filed away in some dusty archive, another loose end tied neatly in bureaucratic red tape. But for Jack, the story was far from over. In the quiet of the evenings, he would retrieve the single folded page from its hiding place. The words Project Chimera and Lelt Thorn had become a mantra of injustice in his mind. The official story was a hollow shell, and Jack knew that inside that shell was a kernel of truth that Lieutenant Arthur Coleman had died to protect. The military had taken the evidence, but they couldn't take Jack's memory of the family in the photograph or the love poured into that unfinished letter. He had a duty that went beyond reporting a crash. He had to find Eleanor. His quest began not in the wilderness he knew so well, but in the sterile, fluorescent light of the town library. Jack, a man more comfortable navigating by the stars than by a search engine, found himself patiently typing names into a computer. Shadow waited for him in the truck, a silent, furry sentinel. Jack's only clues were the names, Lieutenant Arthur Coleman and his daughter, Eleanor. Before the military had arrived, in a moment of foresight he couldn't quite explain, Jack had used his phone to take clear, high-resolution pictures of the photograph and every page of the letter. It felt like a violation at the time, but now it was his only link. He searched through public records, census data, and online military archives. The name Arthur Coleman was common enough to be a labyrinth, but by cross-referencing it with a wife named Mary, a name inscribed on the back of the photograph, the trail began to narrow. He found her obituary, dated 20 years prior. She had passed away in Denver, and listed among the survivors was her beloved daughter, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. The trail was warm now. He followed it through digitized phone books and property records until it led him to an address that was not a house, but a community. Sunny Vistas Retirement Community, on the outskirts of Denver. The drive down from the mountains was like a journey into a different world. The solitude of the pines gave way to the hum of highways, the silence replaced by the noise of a life he had left behind. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head occasionally resting on Jack's shoulder, a reassuring weight. Jack felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced in years. He was about to walk into a stranger's life and reopen a wound that was nearly 80 years old. What right did he have? The image of the smiling family in the photograph gave him his answer. Sunny Vistas was a pleasant, quiet place, with manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds. It smelled of antiseptic polish and old memories. At the front desk, a friendly receptionist with a kind smile directed him to the sunroom where Eleanor Vance liked to spend her afternoons. He found her sitting in a comfortable armchair by a large window, a cascade of afternoon light illuminating her cloud of perfectly white hair. She was knitting, her fingers moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. She was in her early 80s, yet she sat with a straight-backed dignity, And as she looked up at his approach, he saw what the summary in his mind had noted. Her eyes. They were a brilliant, pale blue, and they were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. This was not a frail old woman fading away. This was the daughter of a pilot, and she had her father's focus. "Mrs. Vance?" Jack asked, his voice softer than he intended. She stopped knitting and looked at him, her gaze direct. "Yes? Can I help you?" "My name is Jack Callahan. I apologize for intruding. I'm a veteran. I was hiking in the mountains near my home, and I found something. Something I believe belonged to your father, Lutar Arthur Coleman." The rhythmic click of her knitting needles ceased. Her hands, wrinkled and elegant, came to rest in her lap. The intelligence in her eyes sharpened into a laser-like focus. "My father?" she whispered, the name a fragile relic on her lips. "Yes, ma'am." Jack pulled out his phone, his thumb unsteady as he navigated to the photo gallery. He felt his heart pounding. "The military has the originals now, but I made copies before they arrived." He held out the phone. On the screen was the crisp, clear image of the young family, smiling into the camera. Eleanor's breath hitched. She reached out, her trembling fingers hovering over the screen as if she could touch the faces from her past. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "That's my mother," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And that's me. I still have that dress packed away in a trunk." Jack then swiped to the image of the letter. She leaned closer, her pale blue eyes reading the familiar cursive on the screen. "My dearest Eleanor, my little bird." More tears followed, but these were not just tears of sorrow. They were tears of a long-suppressed love, a memory brought vividly back to life. She took a few moments to compose herself, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief from her sleeve. When she looked back at Jack, the grief in her eyes had been forged into something else. It was a hard, steely resolve. "They told us it was a technical failure," she said, her voice low but clear, without a tremor. "They said the engine failed, that it was a tragic accident. I never believed them, not for one moment." She looked directly into Jack's eyes, a lifetime of doubt and conviction in her gaze. "My father was the best pilot they had. He would not have crashed his plane because of a simple mechanical flaw. Someone did something to him. I've known it my entire life." In that moment, a bond was formed. The old soldier and the pilot's daughter, two strangers united by a secret that had refused to stay buried. Jack knew he was no longer alone on this mission. The fight for Lieutenant Coleman's honor had just found its most important ally. Eleanor's words hung in the quiet air of the sunroom, a declaration of faith held for a lifetime. Jack saw in her pale blue eyes not the faded memory of a grieving child, but the sharp, unwavering certainty of a daughter who knew her father's character. He felt a profound sense of respect. She had carried this burden of doubt alone for nearly 80 years. "Tell me about him," Jack said, his voice gentle. "Tell me everything you remember." A soft, sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Would you join me in my room? It's more private. I have something I want to show you." Jack nodded and followed her down a quiet, sunlit hallway. Her room was small and neat, a sanctuary of a life well lived. Framed photographs adorned the walls, chronicling the decades. Eleanor as a young woman, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. But on her bedside table, pride of place was given to a single, sepia-toned photograph of her father, the handsome, smiling pilot, forever young. She sat in a wingback chair near the window and gestured for Jack to take the seat opposite her. "My father was a brilliant man," she began, her voice gaining strength as she summoned the memories. "He wasn't just a pilot. He was an engineer at heart. He lived and breathed aerodynamics. He saw flight as a kind of poetry. When the war started, he was recruited for a special test pilot program. He was one of the best. He could feel what a plane needed, what it was trying to tell him, through the stick and the rudder pedals." She paused, her gaze distant. "But in the last month, he changed. He was still loving, but he was distracted, tense. He would come home late from the base, his mind a million miles away. He and my mother would have hushed conversations after they thought I was asleep. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I only remember one thing clearly. I was playing with my dolls in the hallway, and I heard him talking to my mother in the kitchen. He said, "Mary, be careful what you say around Marcus Thorne." He was a young lieutenant then, my father's superior officer. My mother asked why, and I will never forget my father's words. He said, "Because he is a man who would trade his own soul for a promotion." The name, Marcus Thorne, struck Jack like a physical blow. It was the same name from the handwritten note. My father never trusted him, Eleanor continued, her eyes locking with Jack's. He said Thorne was ambitious, to the point of being dangerous. That was 2 weeks before his plane went down. With a slow, deliberate grace, Eleanor rose and walked to a beautiful old cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the heavy lid, releasing the faint, sweet scent of cedar and thyme. From beneath a neatly folded flag and a stack of old letters, she retrieved a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was dark and worn smooth with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. "He kept a journal," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she held it out to Jack. "It was his private log. The military gave it back to my mother with his other personal effects. I've kept it all these years. I've read it 100 times, always feeling that the answer was in here, hidden in the technical jargon I could never understand." "Id fiver munning." Jack took the journal with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred text. He was now holding a direct link to the man himself. He opened it carefully. The first several pages were filled with the precise, confident script of an engineer, detailing flight characteristics, engine performance, and weather conditions. Then, about halfway through, the entries changed. The heading at the top of a new page read, "Project Chimera, First Test Flight." Jack read, engrossed, as Lieutenant Coleman described the project with a palpable excitement. "This device is revolutionary," he wrote. "It's not just a radar. It's an active intercept system. It paints a picture of the airspace so clear it feels like cheating. In the tests, I could track and anticipate the movements of 5 separate bogies from over 100 miles away. This could make our boys untouchable. It could end the war." As the entries progressed, the name Thorne began to appear. At first, the mentions were professional, if slightly annoyed. Lieutenant Thorne is intensely curious about the project. His questions are less about operational theory and more about the specific components and frequencies. He seems to care more for the ingredients than the recipe. A week later, the tone shifted. The handwriting was a little less precise. "Thorne is pushing for full copies of the schematics. I told him it was a direct violation of protocol. All blueprints are to remain in the lab's safe. He said he needed them for a report for the brass, but it didn't feel right. He was angry when I refused." Jack's blood ran cold as he turned to the final 2 pages. The change was stark. The neat, disciplined script was gone, replaced by a frantic, slanted scrawl. The words seemed to leap from the page, charged with fear and adrenaline. The 14th of October. I saw him. I went back to the lab late tonight to double-check a calibration, and I saw Thorne. He was using a personal camera to photograph the blueprints. He had them laid out on the table. He didn't see me. My God, what is he doing? Who is he selling them to? The final entry was dated the morning of his death. It was barely legible. The 16th of October. Thorne has scheduled a solo, high-altitude stress test for me this morning. He says it's to test the Chimera unit's housing under extreme pressure. There are no other pilots scheduled to be in the air. It feels wrong. The story doesn't add up. It feels like a trap. I have to go, it's a direct order. But if something happens to me today, if I don't come back, it was him. It was Thorne. Jack closed the journal. The silence in the room was absolute. He looked up at Eleanor. Her face was a mask of sorrow, but underneath the pain, there was a glimmer of something else. Vindication. The secret she had carried in her heart for a lifetime was no longer just a daughter's intuition. It was here, written in her father's own hand. It was proof of a brilliant project, a terrible betrayal, and a cold, calculated murder. The air in Eleanor's small room was thick with the ghosts of the past. The truth, finally unearthed, was a raw and painful thing. Eleanor wept silently, not the wild tears of fresh grief, but the slow, heavy tears of a sorrow long carried and finally understood. For 80 years, she had lived with the shadow of a question. Now, she had the terrible certainty of an answer. Jack gave her a few moments, his own heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The soldier in him recognized the landscape of betrayal. He had seen it on a smaller scale in the field, but this was different. This was a betrayal that had festered for a lifetime, poisoning a family's memory and a nation's history. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "there's more. The day the military came to my cabin, I didn't trust them. They were too quick, too dismissive. Before I gave them the satchel, I kept one thing. X-line. And thereafter, is." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small, waterproof pouch. From it, he carefully extracted the single, folded page. He handed it to her. Her brow furrowed as she read the urgent handwritten notes again. The name, Project Chimera. The suspicions about Thorn. "This was in the satchel your father carried," Jack explained. "It seems to be a summary of his final fears, perhaps a last-ditch effort to get the word out if something happened to his journal." "It like his chain." Eleanor looked from the note to the journal in Jack's hands, and a look of profound understanding dawned on her face. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew he was in danger, and he was trying to leave a trail." She looked up at Jack, her blue eyes filled with a new fire. "You must take the journal. You are the only other person who knows. You have to see this through." The drive back up the mountain was a grim, silent journey. The setting sun painted the peaks in hues of orange and purple, but Jack saw none of it. His mind was a whirlwind, replaying the words from the journal, the cold finality of the last entry. When he finally reached his cabin, Shadow greeted him at the door with a worried whine, sensing the deep change in his master's demeanor. Inside, under the steady glow of the lamp, Jack laid the two pieces of evidence side by side on the table, the open journal and the single, desperate note. It was a stark tableau, a conversation across 8 decades between a man who had discovered a terrible secret and a man who had stumbled upon its consequences. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The handwriting on the note was identical to the journal's final, frantic entries. The terminology, the names, the dates, all aligned. The note was the pilot's insurance policy, a condensed version of his accusation carried on his person in the hope that it might survive even if the rest of his plane did not. He read the lines again, this time with the full context of the journal. Lieutenant Coleman had discovered that Thorn, his ambitious and untrustworthy superior, was systematically photographing the blueprints for Project Chimera. Why? A man like Thorn, the kind of man who would trade his soul for a promotion, didn't risk everything for a hobby. He wasn't a spy driven by ideology. He was driven by greed. And a project that could change the course of the war was the most valuable commodity on the planet. Jack thought back to the geopolitical landscape of the time. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies of convenience against a common enemy, but mistrust was rampant. A technology that could render enemy air forces obsolete would be priceless to a nation like the Soviets, who were already looking ahead to the post-war balance of power. Thorn wasn't just stealing. He was planning to sell his country's greatest secret to a future adversary. This wasn't just theft. This was treason. And with that realization came the second, colder one, the final flight. Thorn had arranged it, a solo flight, a high-altitude stress test. It was the perfect setup. Jack, having planned and survived his share of missions, could see the chilling military logic. As the supervising officer, Thorn would have had access to the flight plan, the maintenance logs, everything. A little water in a fuel line, a loosened bolt on a control surface. A simple, untraceable act of sabotage that would send a brilliant pilot and his revolutionary secret spiraling into the most remote, inaccessible terrain imaginable. The crash would be blamed on a known mechanical flaw or pilot error, and Thorne would be the only one who knew the truth. He had arranged not just an accident, but an execution. He had murdered Lieutenant Arthur Coleman to silence the only witness to his treason. Jack leaned back in his chair, the full weight of the discovery settling upon him. He had come to these mountains to escape war, to find peace in a world free of secrets and lies. But war had found him, a war that had been fought not on a battlefield, but in the secret heart of a man, a war whose only casualty lay buried on this mountain for 80 years. He looked around his small, quiet cabin at the sleeping form of his loyal dog. This was no longer just about a suspicious plane crash. It was not even just about bringing peace to an old woman in Denver. This was about an act of high treason that had gone unpunished. A murderer and a traitor, Marcus Thorne, had likely gone on to have a long, decorated career, his life built on the bones of a hero he had sent to his death. The crime hadn't ended in 1944. It had been festering for nearly 80 years, a poison in the heart of the nation's history. And now, by a sheer accident of fate, he, Jack Callahan, was the only person alive who held the antidote. The knowledge of Thorne's betrayal settled into Jack's life like a permanent winter chill. The peaceful solitude he had cultivated in his mountain cabin now felt fragile, the silence charged with a new, menacing energy. He spoke with Eleanor on the phone every day, their conversations brief and cautious, a lifeline of shared purpose in a growing sea of danger. They agreed that their first step was to understand the man Marcus Thorne had become. The enemy, you know, Jack thought, is always better than the one you don't. His research began back at the town library. The official records painted a picture of a model officer. Marcus Thorne's career after the war had been a steep, unbroken climb. He had collected medals in Korea and served in high-level advisory roles in the Pentagon during Vietnam. He had retired nearly 2 decades ago as a 4-star general, a man lauded for his strategic acumen and unwavering patriotism. Now, he sat on the boards of several of the nation's largest defense contractors, a respected elder statesman of the military-industrial complex. He was powerful, wealthy, and woven into the very fabric of the establishment. He was, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. It was on his 3rd trip back from the library that he noticed it. A black sedan, a generic, late-model car with tinted windows, was behind him. It was completely out of place on the winding, gravel-dusted mountain roads where aging pickup trucks and jeeps were the norm. He slowed down, and it slowed down. He sped up, and it maintained its distance. It followed him for 5 miles before peeling off onto a side road that led nowhere. Jack's internal alarms, dormant for years but never truly silenced, began to ring. 2 days later, he saw it again. It was parked at a scenic overlook a mile down the road from his property, a spot that gave it a clear, unobstructed view of his cabin and the long driveway leading to it. There was no one outside the car. It just sat there, a silent black sentinel. He was being watched. Thorne, or people loyal to Thorne, knew who he was and where he was. The message was clear: "We see you." The nights became the hardest part. Jack found himself sleeping lightly. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of a nocturnal animal, pulling him from the edge of sleep. He took to keeping Lieutenant Coleman's journal and the handwritten note in the waterproof pouch on his person at all times, even when he slept. His only comfort was Shadow. The dog seemed to feel the shift in the atmosphere, his usual relaxed posture replaced by a state of quiet alertness. He would often lie before the door instead of the hearth, his head up, his ears twitching at every distant sound, a low growl occasionally rumbling in his chest. One night a storm rolled in from the west, cloaking the mountain in a torrent of wind and rain. The sound of the deluge was a roar, a perfect cover for any unwanted approach. Jack was in a deep, restless sleep when he was violently pulled from a dream of falling. It wasn't a noise that woke him. It was a vibration through the floorboards and the sudden, explosive eruption of the animal at the foot of his bed. Shadow went from a deep sleep to a furious, snarling mass of muscle and teeth in a fraction of a second. He launched himself from the bedroom, his barks not the sharp, warning yaps of a territorial dog, but the deep, ferocious roars of a protector engaged in battle. Jack was out of bed instantly, his hand grabbing the rifle he now kept leaning against his nightstand. He heard a crash from the main room, the sound of his table lamp smashing, followed by a man's sharp cry of pain and terror. He rounded the corner just in time to see a dark figure scrambling backward through the front door, which now hung open, its lock splintered. Shadow was a blur of gray and white fur, lunging and snapping, all discipline training forgotten in a primal display of loyalty and defense. The intruder, a large man dressed in black, stumbled off the porch and disappeared into the sheeting rain and darkness, clutching his arm. "Shadow, heel!" Jack commanded, his voice sharp. The dog immediately obeyed, breaking off the chase and returning to Jack's side, his body trembling with adrenaline, a low, menacing growl still vibrating in his throat. Jack peered out into the storm, but saw nothing. The man was gone. He quickly shut and barred the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt and ran his hands over Shadow, checking for any injuries. The dog was fine, licking Jack's hand frantically, his amber eyes still locked on the door. "Good boy," Jack whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved us, boy." His eyes swept the room. The intruder hadn't gotten far. The lamp was shattered on the floor, and the table, where he had been studying the journal just hours before, was in disarray, its contents swiped to the floor. The man hadn't been a simple burglar. A burglar would have gone for his guns, his tools. This man had been searching for something specific. He had come for the proof. Standing in the middle of his violated sanctuary, one hand resting on the warm, bristling fur of his defender, Jack finally understood the full, terrifying scope of his enemy. General Marcus Thorne was not some distant historical figure. He was an active, present threat. He was a man with immense power and influence, a man who could dispatch skilled operatives to a remote cabin in the middle of a storm. He was a man who, after 80 years, was still willing to do anything, to silence anyone, to keep his treason buried. The watching shadows had a long reach, and they had just shown him they were not afraid to strike. The morning after the break-in, the storm had passed, leaving the mountain air scrubbed clean and sharp. But the peace Jack had once found in this pristine world was shattered. As he hammered a new plank into his splintered doorframe, he felt a cold certainty. He was out of his depth. This wasn't a fight he could win alone. General Thorne was not a man, but an institution, a network of power and influence built over 80 years. To fight him with just a journal and a rifle was suicide. He needed a different kind of weapon and a different kind of soldier. He drove into town and made the call to Eleanor. He told her everything: the black sedan, the intruder, Shadow's heroic defense. He heard her sharp intake of breath over the line. But her voice, when she spoke, was not frail with fear, but hardened with resolve. "I was afraid of this," she said. "Men like Thorne don't just fade away. They bury their mistakes. Jack, you can't do this on your own. You need to bring the truth to the light." "How?" Jack asked, the frustration evident in his voice. Who would listen? Who would dare to go up against a man like that? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I may know someone," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "A few years ago, a journalist interviewed me for a piece on military families. She was young, but she was tenacious. She had a fire in her. She wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions. Her name is Sarah Jenkins." "That has." Eleanor gave him the contact information, along with a warning. "She's a bulldog, Jack. She won't believe you easily. You'll have to earn her trust." Finding Sarah Jenkins was easy. She was a rising star in the world of investigative journalism, known for a series of hard-hitting articles that had exposed corruption in both corporate and government circles. Her bio on the newspaper's website described her as specializing in stories that powerful people don't want told. She was exactly who he needed. Their first phone call was tense. Jack, conditioned by a lifetime of military discretion, was guarded. Sarah, accustomed to dealing with conspiracy theorists, was professional but deeply skeptical. He spoke in generalities about a World War cover-up and a decorated officer's hidden history. It was just enough to light the fuse of her journalistic curiosity. They agreed to meet at a quiet diner in Denver the next day. Sarah Jenkins was in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent brown eyes that seemed to be constantly analyzing her surroundings. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore a simple blazer and jeans, an outfit that was both professional and ready for action. She had an aura of restless energy, a cynical edge, honed by her profession, but underneath it, Jack sensed a fierce, unyielding idealism. She listened intently as Jack laid out the story, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt, simply nodding occasionally, her gaze never leaving his. He told her about finding the plane, about the satchel, about the official story from the Air Force, and about the break-in. It was an incredible tale, and he could see the wall of her professional skepticism rising with every word. "It's a fascinating story, Mr. Callahan," she said when he finished, her tone polite but non-committal. "A historical mystery. But it's based on your interpretation of events. Do you have any hard evidence?" This was the moment. Jack hadn't brought the physical journal, deeming it too risky. Instead, he pulled a slim tablet from his bag. "The originals are too precious to carry," he said. "But I documented everything." He first showed her the photos of Lute Coleman's journal. She leaned forward, her skepticism giving way to intense focus as she zoomed in on the frantic, final entries. He saw her eyes widen slightly at the name Marcus Thorne and the chilling final words, "It feels like a trap." Next, he showed her the photo of the handwritten note from the satchel, the one that corroborated the journal's claims. Her posture changed. She was no longer just listening. She was investigating. Finally, he played the video he had recorded of his conversation with Eleanor. On the screen, the elderly woman's testimony was quiet, dignified, and devastatingly powerful. Her raw emotion, her lifelong certainty of a terrible injustice, was more convincing than any document. When the video ended, Sarah was silent for a long moment. She looked from the tablet back to Jack, and he saw that the cynical journalist had been replaced by the tenacious bulldog Eleanor had described. "My God," she whispered. "If this is true, it's true," Jack said simply. "And the man who did it is still out there, protecting his legacy." FDI. The Erforso, as Hawkavan Sai. Sarah's mind was already racing, the pieces clicking into place. A decorated general, a defense contractor, a secret Wordle 2 project. This is more than a cover-up. This goes deep. She started firing questions, her voice sharp and precise, testing the timeline, the evidence, the potential weaknesses in the story. She was no longer questioning its validity. She was planning her attack. After an hour, she leaned back, a look of grim determination on her face. "Okay, Jack," she said, using his first name for the first time. "I'm in. But you need to understand, a man like General Thorne will have buried this under 80 years of concrete. We can't go after him head-on. We need to find the cracks." She pulled out a pen and started scribbling in a notebook. "I'll start with Freedom of Information Act requests. They'll be stonewalled, but it will start a paper trail. I'll dig into his service record, look for any anomalies around the time of Coleman's death. But most importantly," she said, her brown eyes glinting, "I'm going to follow the money. Treason on this scale always leaves a financial ghost. It might be faint, but it'll be there. I'll find it." She told him to go home, to be careful, and that she would be in touch through a secure messaging app. As Jack left the diner, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He was no longer a lone man shouting into the wind. He had an ally, and she was a fighter. The weeks that followed felt like a siege. Jack remained at his cabin, the mountain silence that had once been a comfort, now a source of constant, nerve-wracking tension. He and Sarah communicated only through an encrypted messaging app, their exchanges a slow drip of updates and frustrations. General Thorne had built a fortress around his past, a wall of classified documents, political connections, and 80 years of silence. Jack's days fell into a grim routine. He would patrol the perimeter of his property each morning, his rifle in hand, Shadow moving like a silent gray ghost at his side. He reinforced the windows and barricaded the door each night. He was a soldier again, defending a small patch of ground against an unseen enemy. His only solace was the unwavering presence of his dog, who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, often resting his heavy head on Jack's knee as if to say, "I am here. We are in this together." Sarah, meanwhile, was fighting a different kind of war. She was navigating a labyrinth of archives, filing Freedom of Information requests that were immediately denied, and chasing down leads that went cold. The official story was ironclad. Then, one evening, his phone buzzed with a message from her. 3 urgent words. "I found it." He called her immediately. Her voice on the other end was a mixture of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated triumph. "It wasn't in his military record, Jack," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It was in the trade ledgers, the financial trail." She explained that she had stopped looking for a direct payment for treason. Instead, she had started investigating the finances of the companies Thorne had advised after the war. And there, buried in the post-war chaos of European reconstruction, she found it. A shell corporation, registered in Switzerland, had received a series of massive, anonymous wire transfers in late 1945. The corporation's sole purpose seemed to be investing in emerging technology firms. Its owner was a name she didn't recognize, but after weeks of digging, she had traced it back through 2 different intermediaries to Marcus Thorne. "And here's the smoking gun, Jack," she said, her voice electric. "I cross-referenced the dates of those bank transfers with declassified intelligence reports on Soviet technological development. The exact same month Thorne received his first massive payment, a Soviet Aviation Design Bureau made a sudden quantum leap in their experimental radar program. A leap that, according to the analysts at the time, was inexplicable. The technology they suddenly developed was a near-perfect mirror of Project Chimera. The money, the timing, the technology. It was all there. The financial ghost had finally given up its secret. Sarah told him she was writing the story. Her editor, a tough old-school newsman named David Chen, was backing her. But the paper's legal team was terrified. They were vetting every word, every source. The plan was to publish in the big Sunday edition, giving it maximum impact. The calm before the storm was the worst. 2 days before publication, the first wave of Thorne's counterattack hit. Sarah called, her voice strained. "He knows, Jack. He knows we're coming." Powerful figures had begun calling her editor. A retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the CEO of a massive defense firm, 2 influential senators. The message was always the same, a polite but chilling piece of advice. Drop the story. It was a threat to national security. It would tarnish the reputation of a great American patriot. David Chen was holding firm, Sarah said, but the pressure was immense. The second wave of the attack came directly for Jack. That evening, his satellite phone rang. It was an unlisted number, he answered, his hand instinctively going to rest on Shadow's head. The voice on the other end was old, cultured, and coated in a thin veneer of civility that did nothing to hide the cold menace beneath. "Mr. Callahan," it said, "you are a difficult man to reach." Jack didn't have to ask. It was him, General Marcus Thorne. "You're a fool," the old general continued, his voice as sharp and cold as ice. "A broken-down old soldier, meddling in affairs far beyond your comprehension. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy? All you have done is stumble into history and threaten to dishonor men far better than yourself. Lutai Coleman was one of those men, Jack said, his own voice low and steady. A dry, humorless chuckle came through the phone. Coleman was a casualty of war. Nothing more. You need to stop this. Call off your little journalist friend. Let the dead rest in peace. The general's voice dropped, the fake civility vanishing completely. You have a nice, quiet life up there on that mountain? A nice, quiet cabin? That loyal shepherd of yours. It would be a shame if anything were to disturb your peace. It was an unmistakable threat, delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known consequences. Jack's hand tightened in Shadow's fur. His own anger, cold and disciplined, rose to meet the general's menace. Is that what you told Coleman before you had him killed? The line went dead. He immediately called Sarah and told her what had happened. Any fear she might have had was instantly burned away by journalistic fury. He threatened you? He threatened your dog? She seethed. That's it. He's desperate. He just gave us the confirmation we needed. The story is running. The final hours were the longest of Jack's life. He sat in his armchair, his rifle across his lap, Shadow awake and alert at his feet. He was not just waiting for a newspaper to be published. He was waiting for the enemy to make a move. But the night remained quiet. The only sound was the wind and the steady breathing of his dog. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the eastern peaks, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. It contained only a web link. With a trembling finger, Jack tapped it. The web page loaded, and the headline exploded onto the screen in bold, stark letters. 80-year betrayal. Decorated General Marcus Thorne, implicated in WWII murder, treason plot. And beneath those words was a photo, not of the old, powerful general. It was the photo from the satchel of a young, handsome pilot in his uniform, smiling with his wife and little girl. Lieutenant Arthur Coleman's story was finally being told. The unmasking had begun. The publication of Sarah's article was not a pebble dropped in a pond. It was a boulder. The story exploded across the national consciousness. A stunning tale of heroism and betrayal that had been hidden for the better part of a century. For the first few days, Thorne's powerful network tried to fight back, issuing denials and casting aspersions on Jack's character and Sarah's journalism. But the evidence was too strong, the narrative too compelling. The scanned pages of the journal, the financial records, and the quiet, undeniable dignity of Eleanor's testimony created a tidal wave of public outrage that could not be ignored. Under the relentless pressure, the walls of silence around the Department of Defense began to crumble. Veterans groups and elected officials demanded a formal inquiry. Within a week, the Secretary of the Air Force announced that the case of Lieutenant Arthur Coleman was being officially reopened. The final, decisive moment came not with a bang, but with a quiet news alert that flashed across Jack's phone as he sat in the town's small diner. General Marcus Thorne, age 98, had been arrested by federal agents at his sprawling estate in Virginia. Jack watched the television screen above the counter, which showed the old, frail-looking man being led in handcuffs to a black car. He looked small and pathetic, a ghost stripped of his power, his 80-year reign of lies finally at an end. Jack felt no triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of justice delivered. Several months later, after Thorne was formally indicted on charges of murder and treason, a formal invitation arrived at Jack's cabin. It was from the Department of the Air Force, inviting him to a ceremony at Buckley Air Force Base. They were officially correcting the record. Lieutenant Arthur Coleman was to be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, and Eleanor had requested that Jack be the one to receive the flag on her behalf. The day of the ceremony was clear and cold, the Colorado sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The airbase tarmac was a sea of dress blues, the formal uniforms a stark contrast to the rugged fatigues Jack was used to. He stood awkwardly in his best suit, feeling out of place, until Sarah Jenkins gave him a reassuring nod from the press area, and Eleanor, seated in a wheelchair in the front row, offered him a warm, grateful smile. The ceremony was a masterpiece of military pageantry and solemn remembrance. A chaplain spoke of sacrifice. A four-star general, the Air Force Chief of Staff, stood at a podium and publicly disavowed the official story of technical failure, calling it a grievous error that was now being rectified. He spoke of Lieutenant Coleman's genius, his bravery, and his unwavering commitment to his duty even in the face of betrayal from within. Then came the flyover. 4 vintage P-47 Thunderbolts, identical to the one Jack had found, roared across the sky in a diamond formation. As they passed over the ceremony, one of the planes peeled off, climbing steeply into the heavens until it was just a speck, leaving the others to continue on. The missing man formation. A salute to the fallen. There wasn't a dry eye on the tarmac. Finally, the honor guard performed the flag-folding ceremony. The crisp, deliberate movements, the 13 precise folds transforming the broad banner into a tight blue triangle of stars, were a familiar and deeply moving ritual for Jack. An officer presented the folded flag to the Chief of Staff, who then turned and walked directly to Jack. Jack stood at attention as the general stopped before him. He accepted the flag, its weight both symbolic and real. Then he turned and walked the few steps to Eleanor. He knelt before her, just as tradition dictated, and looked into her tear-filled but shining eyes. "On behalf of the President of the United States," Jack said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide, "and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service." Eleanor placed her trembling hands over his as she took the flag, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You brought my father home. It can't or dine." In that moment, Jack's unspoken promise to the ghost in the cockpit was fulfilled. The drive back to the mountains that evening was different from all the ones that had come before. The road was the same, but the man driving it was not. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for years had finally gone. The landscape, which had so recently felt menacing and full of watching shadows, was once again just beautiful, peaceful, and wild. He was going home. That night, Jack sat on his porch, a mug of warm coffee in his hands. The sun had set, and a blanket of brilliant stars was emerging in the clear, cold sky. Shadow came and rested his great, noble head on Jack's lap, letting out a deep sigh of contentment. The cabin was no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary once more. The silence was no longer heavy with secrets, but filled with a profound and healing peace. Jack looked down at the magnificent animal beside him, the loyal friend who had started this entire journey with a curious nose and an insistent whine. He had come to these mountains to run away from the man the war had made him, a man haunted by memories and stripped of purpose. But by fighting one last battle, not of violence, but of truth, he had found something he thought was lost forever. He had not only restored the honor of a fallen soldier, in the process, he had finally, truly, restored his own. His war was over. He was at peace. Sometimes, the deepest echoes are not left by grand battles, but by quiet acts of loyalty. A promise kept to a fallen soldier, a family's unwavering faith, and the steadfast devotion of a dog to his master. These are the truths that time cannot erase. If these echoes of honor and love resonate with you, you are part of our community. Help us keep these stories alive by sharing your thoughts in the comments and by subscribing to our channel. The journey doesn't have to end here. Thanks for watching. Another story of an unbreakable bond is waiting for you now, right on the screen. Simply click to continue the inspiration.